Um, Dr. Ann Beal is the founder and CEO of AbsoluteJOI Skincare. She's a member of the Board of Academy Health and also a member of the Board of Directors of GSK. Prior to her current roles, Dr. Beal spent 6 years as instructor at Harvard Medical School and Mass General Hospital. With triple Ivy degrees, she's an amazing woman. She holds a BA from Brown University, an MD from Cornell University Medical College, and a Master's of Public Health from Columbia University. Our moderator today is Tara Giunta, whose name I always massacre.
Wow, that was perfect.
She's a partner in the litigation department and a vice chair of the investigations and white collar defense practices at Paul Hastings. Tara serves as co-chair of the Paul Hastings Global Diversity Council and chair of the firm's Women's Initiative. She's also founder and editor of the firm's publication, Breaking the Glass Ceiling, Women in the Boardroom. Without further ado, I am going to turn this over to Tara and Dr. Beal. So thank you again for joining us.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Diane and Dr. Beal. It's a real pleasure to be speaking with you today. I really enjoyed our time together when we were prepping for this to really get to know you a bit more. And you have so many pearls of wisdom to share. So I hope we get to most of them, at least during this time. Where I'd like to start is for you to just tell us a bit about your journey. I mean, Diane has given us some of the highlights in terms of your academic accomplishments and career, but can you just tell us a little bit about your journey and kind of what led you to where you are today?
Sure. So thank you, Diane, for inviting me, and Tara for today's moderation, and thanks everyone for joining. Before we jump in, I'll preface this by saying this is the year that I'm turning 60 years old. And so you should all be warned that as one gets older, one has less and less time for nonsense. And so I'm very committed to, speaking my truth, if nothing else. So, and so I'm literally living fearless and happy to be able to speak truth to power on any number of issues. So be forewarned. So I am a kid from Queens, New York, grew up in the city, and was very fortunate to have gone to actually one of the exam schools. I don't know if anybody on the call is from New York City and understands what the exam, okay, Jane, and understands the exam school process. But these are, some of the top schools in the country, and it's very, very competitive to get into. So I was incredibly fortunate because I came from a neighborhood that did not have good schools whatsoever, but was able to place into a school called Hunter, which set me on my trajectory. And yes, I am triple Ivied, and it is not because those Ivies have prepared me. It was actually that high school that prepared me to be able to then go into these Ivies. I was also fortunate in that it was when I was there an all-girl high school, and that's something that I talk about a lot. I talked about it with my daughters, and I'm happy to say my youngest is now at a women's college down in Atlanta, Spelman. And I think that is actually very important for one's education, because we've all had these periods in our lives where there's a voice in your head saying you can't do this, you shouldn't do that. And it's often an internal voice. And so by having gone to a school like Hunter, where every day we were told that we were talented and gifted, and we weren't allowed to learn how to type because Hunter girls don't type. They hire people who type. It frankly set me up to really feel very comfortable. Oh, so we have another alum who's, but in the co-ed years. But it basically set me up to feel comfortable in whatever space that I was in, particularly when it comes to intellectual competition. Essentially, there's no one that can grasp anything that I can't grasp. And it has served as a mantra for me, because a lot of times I'm like, well, look, if these guys can do it, I can do it. Has often been something that I have said over the course of my life. So I'm a physician by training, a pediatrician, and actually started my career with plans to go and work in the South Bronx, and always wanted to work with underserved patient populations. And so it's not then surprising that my first position was actually working in homeless health, where I was working on mobile medical units that went around New York City to deliver healthcare services to children living in the shelter system. But I very quickly started to realize that I was one physician working on just major problems, and knew that I wanted to be in more of a position of power to influence where resources go. And so this led me to an interest in health policy. And when I looked at people who were 10 years ahead of me doing health policy work that I found interesting, many of them had come into academia. So I actually thought academia was very irrelevant to like the average Joe on the street, and was not interested in it. And so even though I was at Cornell and Columbia, I didn't have the plans to go into academia. But after seeing that people who were doing interesting things had gone into academia, that's when I took on the position at Harvard. So I moved up to Boston and was faculty there. Did that for a number of years, and really was very specific and deliberate in not wanting to be Harvard faculty for my entire life, but to use it as a jumping off point to establish a national reputation for myself. So when I left there after 6 years, then that led me to then a health policy foundation, the Commonwealth Fund, which I often describe as the best job that I've had my entire career. Spent 6 years there working on issues of quality care for underserved patient populations, and really learned health policy. But then at that point, I was, a program officer at a small foundation, and I wanted to lead something larger. And so I said, well, I need to be able to lead something smaller, and recognize that I didn't have management skills, that I wasn't able to demonstrate that I knew how to develop and implement strategy, and that I needed to be in a space and a place where the benefits and the successes of the work were definitely going to be attributed to my efforts. So decided that in order to lead something big, I would need to lead something small. So then left the fund to then go and become president of the Aetna Foundation, which was $25 million a year. So not huge, but not tiny. And it allowed me to work on some of our priorities in terms of obesity, in terms of waste in healthcare, and then in terms of quality of care and for underserved populations and health disparities. And so I was actually planning to stay there a little bit longer. And I consider that my mini MBA, because it was the first time that I was in a for-profit environment. And I was fortunate in that I was one of the top 200 executives. They would have all these kind of meetings and stuff for the top executives. But I had no P&L responsibility. I was not responsible for any arms of the business. So I got to sit in the business discussions, but my responsibility was, my lane was around the philanthropic efforts with the foundation. So I used it as an opportunity to really learn a lot about business and how does one think in terms of business. And again, I remember the friends from undergrad who had gone to business school, I were like, they were the ones who failed out of organic chem. So if they could figure it out, then I could definitely figure it out. And so essentially used it to start to educate myself about how does business think and run and strategy, et cetera. And then got tapped to go to Quorum, which was created out of the Affordable Care Act. And that was one of the organizations that was created because obviously the ACA was designed to help bring coverage to so many different people. But then there were efforts to try to bring benefits in terms of healthcare quality to people who are already currently insured. And so that brought me to Washington, where I was initially employee number 2. And so really was very much a startup. Our first year, our budget was 150 million. Second year was 500 million. Third year was 750 million. And it's not just that it was a lot of money, but that we had to get it out the door, and that we had to do it with a lot of government oversight because these are federal dollars. And we had to do it in a politically contentious environment because we were an arm of the Affordable Care Act. So that was drinking from a fire hose. And I always come out of there and saying, that I know more about employment law than any physician should, because I had to stand up the organization and do all that needed to do to build the organization. But what I was most proud of is because we were patient-centered, what we had to do was to define what does that mean when one puts it into practice, and what does it mean within a research context. And so I remember at one point we were doing all this research, trying to see what others were doing, and there was really no precedent. So I said to my team, I said, so the good news is no one can tell us that we're doing it wrong, because we're the first ones doing it. We're not going to be expert at it. We're not going to be, the best, but literally nobody knows more about this than we do. So let's just jump on in and make it happen. And so we established some principles around participatory research for patients, community engagement in terms of research, identifying questions that are relevant to research as compared to relevant to researchers, and some of the principles about participatory research that I think were really very helpful. And so then and did that while like managing afternoons on the Hill, evenings at the White House, and the morning spent picking the carpet colors for the office, because it was a startup. So it was just complete end to end. And so did that for a number of years. And then I got tapped to actually work in a pharmaceutical company, which when they first reached out, I was like, nope, not interested. And it was actually some of the patients and the patient groups that I was working with who said, actually, it's pharma that really supports a lot of our efforts. They're the only ones who fund us. And so they're like, and there's really good work that can come out of pharma. So I said, well, let me go and check it out. And they were creating a role called the Chief Patient Officer. So I was the first chief patient officer in the top 10 pharmaceutical globally. And again, we had to make it up from the ground up. What does this mean within a global context? What does it mean from a cross-cultural perspective? What does it mean for everyone from our R&D colleagues to market access to finance to just everyone across the enterprise? And so that was a learning experience on so many levels, drinking from the fire hose. But one of the things, if anybody on the call speaks French, you know that every word that ends in AGE in English is probably a French word, and that includes patronage. And so I was actually hired by a female executive who 18 months into my tenure lost her position. She was pushed out. And so that meant that my internal patronage needed to just disappeared. And so I was really trying to think through, what should I do? And so reached out to another female executive, and she said, well, we're in a very operational industry, and you are a strategic function, and strategy is the first thing that goes out the window when you're in an operational industry. So what she advised is, she was like, get as close to P&L as possible, demonstrate that you can have an impact on P&L, and then you will do well, which is exactly what we did. And so, when people question, well, what is it that you're doing and how do you operationalize this? I could talk about issues of behavioral economics and applying it at scale to patients to improve use of our products, to demonstrate not only that it improves the health outcomes, but then it improves their utilization. And while there are firewalls that prevent us from showing that it has an improvement on the bottom line, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that if you sell more product, somehow that's going to, help you with your bottom line. So then did that, but then also was getting incredibly frustrated. Partially, it was a French company, and you very rarely see senior executives who are women in these French companies. But also, I had experienced that there was a lot of talk about the patient and a lot of talk about interest, but didn't really see it manifest in a real way that I felt was quite substantive. So decided that I wanted to pull out and kind of do my own thing, whether start my own organization or to be the leader of an organization. And then also had the experience, because I was living in Paris, that I started to really develop an understanding of the amount of anti-Semitism that exists in Europe. And it's something that I think we don't know and appreciate coming from the United States. And certainly, like, I grew up in New York, right? So like, Jewish people, Jewish culture is not anything that's foreign to us. But in Europe, it's very different. And Europe is based on, a collective of nations that have actually a lot of religious contention that are like, Protestants versus the Catholics, much less if you're Jewish, it's a whole nother story. And so realizing that and seeing that, it made me start to realize that some of the things that I had observed on Jewish culture, and I trained at Einstein, which is a yeshiva affiliated institution. And so, the focus on education, the focus on family, the focus on certain types of businesses. So, people are accountants, dentists, doctors, lawyers, not because this is what people want to do, but historically, if you couldn't get a job, you could always hang up a shingle and make a living for yourself in these different types of roles. And so it started to make me really think about the role of African Americans within the United States, and recognizing that this is not a warm and fuzzy place for us, that it's often a hostile environment. And what is it that we can do and learn from Jewish survival in Europe that could be applied to African American survival within the United States? And so it was then also that I heard a colleague who talked about health outcomes. And one of the things that he said is your zip code is more important than your genetic code in terms of determining health outcomes. And so I really started to think about the fact that there's an opportunity in terms of looking at economic development and looking at opportunities that come from economic independence and what are the opportunities that exist. It also was, from a political perspective, a time where I saw many female colleagues after 20, 30 years doing well, all of a sudden we're having performance issues and we're being forced out of their jobs. I think it was politically an environment that was incredibly hostile to women and female leadership in general. And so I decided that I wanted to do something that I would create from the ground up that would have a focus and emphasis on meeting the needs of particularly women of color, but then also has in the background an agenda around economic development that we use to help others. And so that's what led to the launch of AbsoluteJOI. I actually Googled what are the highest margin businesses out there. And so like jewelry, accounting, physicians' offices, and skincare are, you know, some of these businesses. And I noticed that there's actually a good Jewish representation in a lot of those industries as well. So I was like, okay, I see what you're doing. And so decided that I wanted to do skincare because it makes sense for me as a physician. I understand the chemistry, I understand what people need. I did the market research and saw that there was a huge unmet need, particularly for women over 35, and women of color over 35 are just invisible within the industry. So I recognized that there was a real opportunity and some blue skies in that space. And so decided to launch my company, and here I am 4 years later.
That's great. Wow. That all in 15 minutes. I don't know how you got all of that out, Anne. So, and it's interesting you talk about all-girl education, because I went to an all-girl school for 13 years before college, and really credit that also, because the expectation and the environment is, yeah, go for it, right? There's no gender profiling type of dynamic at play there. Before we go into some of your additional words of wisdom, but tell us more about AbsoluteJOI. And because we were talking before this got underway about just some of the practical challenges of running a skincare company right now with the supply chain and the like, but tell us a little bit about kind of how you set it up, what are some of the challenges that you've had, and kind of over the last 3 or 4 years that AbsoluteJOI has been in existence.
All right, so the challenges are like COVID, and capital. That's really, you know, the challenges for starting up this business. So the first issue was finding a manufacturer who would work with me. And so I really very much wanted to be in Europe, because I know, again, from pharma, that their manufacturing standards are very high. And I imagined that this was going to be a company, you know, and I often describe us as the Black Chanel, because people don't think luxury when they think women of color, and yet women of color are uber consumers. And in fact, we consume twice as much on skincare and 7 times as much on hair care as the general population. And so from a market opportunity, I knew that I wanted to have something that was accessible but luxurious, that people felt like it was almost a gift, is the way that I think about it. So knew that I wanted this to be in Europe. And so right outside of Paris, actually, there's a place called the Cosmetic Valley, which is like Silicon Valley, but all cosmetics. And so going to all of these different manufacturers, you have to find somebody who's willing to work with you. And it's not even that they're doing you a favor, because you pay them for the privilege, but you have to work with them. And so, you know, I'm in Europe, and I found, I spoke to at least 5 different manufacturers who were like, you know, I don't understand skin is skin. What is the difference? So I had a hard time with some of these French manufacturers. And through like knowing somebody, like wine in the evening one night with a friend who knew somebody, I actually ended up at a manufacturer who was in Sweden, who he too was like, I don't really see the difference. Skin is skin, and didn't understand what it was that, you know, that there was a market opportunity. And he actually happened to have a friend who is from New Orleans, African-American woman who's living in this town, small town in Sweden. and he happened to have dinner with her that evening. And he was like, so, you know, are there differences? Is there something that we should be getting into, like skincare for women of color? She was like, absolutely, yes. And I would buy it for myself. I would buy it for my kids. I would buy it for my husband. And so then like he called me after giving me a no and said, okay, I will work with you. And so that's what got me started. And then when I came to the US, have actually expanded and looked for additional manufacturers for a number of reasons that we can get into. But so that was the first thing. The other issue is that it takes capital. I mean, anything which is a consumer good, you have to make 1,000 widgets, 10,000 widgets, whatever it is, before you could sell even one. And one of the mistakes that I made is because I'm a scientist, I was very focused on what was in the bottle. And a lot of us think, okay, it's going to be like, you know, 80% development, people will use my product, they'll love it. And then it will just, you know, take off like fireworks. And the fact is, in the beauty industry, it is as much what goes on the bottle and the story and the puff, as I call it, that goes around it. And so I honestly underestimated the capital that I was going to need to invest in marketing, and overestimated the development costs for the products, because I knew exactly what I wanted, and I was very specific. I said it should have this, 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 not have that. It should have a pH of this. So like, you know, gave them the guidance, and usually they say it takes about 5 or 6 efforts in order to make the formula. And for all of them, we were like 1 or 2, because I knew exactly what I wanted, and the chemists were able to deliver. So then when we came back to the United States, one of the reasons why I landed in Washington is, so I call it Google University. Just any question you have, you can look it up. But I was like, you know, what are the top 10 affluent communities for African Americans in the United States? And of those top 10, at least half of them are located in the DMV, the DC, Maryland, Virginia area. So I knew that it would make a lot of sense for me to be there. So that's one of the reasons why we decided to land in Washington when we came back to the United States. And so then initially, I had capital that I invested and was, you know, planning to invest. But then you can see that it's, you know, starting to grow. And one of the concepts is MOQs, minimum order quantities. So when you're working with these manufacturers, if they want to work with you, they will go down to 1,000 units. But most of them are like 3, 5, 10,000 units. And again, that's before you sell one product. And then there's the marketing, and don't even get me started on the legal. But I knew from my time at in pharma that you need to have your legal protections in terms of trademark, and in terms of copyright, and in terms of you know, just making sure everything is pristine, so that like a competitor or nobody can come and sort of mess with your brand. And so there's a lot that I spent in legal before I even made a single product. So all of this is very capital intensive. And so last year started to raise money. And first I was doing it through crowdfunding campaigns, through grants. There's actually a lot of efforts now because of Black Lives Matter. There's different pitch contests and things like that that are inviting small business owners who have Black-owned businesses, women-owned businesses to participate. And so I was cobbling together a number of different things that way. And then started then to do a friends and family round, which I started earlier this year, and actually paused it, not officially, but in my head, because one of the grants that I received was through Glossier, which they did a grant program for Black-owned businesses. And so we were one of the recipients of a $50,000 grant from them. And so have been, you know, cobbling it together, but we're now about $300,000 into the raise that I did. And our target is 500. However, we're now having discussions with a number of different retailers. And so if we get an order for a retailer, we're not at 1,000 units at a time, we're going to be 10,000, 25,000. So I'm going to have to close this round and then go for some 7-figure fundraising to bring on the people who have the expertise in terms of managing these different retailers, and each one is very different. So it's been quite a roller coaster ride, and all of that in the setting of COVID, where last year we were out of stock for 6 months, and we had so much interest from so many people. We have a 30% repeat customer rate, which is incredibly high, especially in e-commerce. And people were like, hello, like, where's the product? And some of the customers, they were calling me a crack dealer. They were like, you can't give us a taste and then not like give us any more. And so, so the products really worked, but we were having such serious supply chain issues. And so that's also part of the reason why I'm bringing the product and the manufacturing back to the US. And it was one of the criteria that I used when I was looking at different manufacturers to see how did they manage COVID last year. And I think this supply chain is something that we're going to have to manage for at least another year.
Yeah, interesting. Well, let's pivot for a minute to some of the words, wisdoms and challenges and women's leadership in business. You've said that, and I quote, "I would like to create a company where women can work hard and be heard, and where they can be leaders." And that, everybody always wants to know what your costs are, what your revenue are, but really you were, of course, all of that, and you've talked about some of those challenges, but also creating that ecosystem and that environment where women leaders can excel and women can learn how to be effective leaders. You've been in worn a lot of different hats over your career thus far. What in your view is preventing women from becoming more effective leaders in business?
Well, what I will say is that it's not the women. And I think that's important because we did this a lot, actually with every company that wants to work on diversity. They're like, okay, we're going to teach you how to speak up, and we're going to teach you how to present yourself, and we're going to teach you how to network, and we're going to teach you all this stuff. But what they don't do is like teach the institution to be a fertile ground for all of this effort. So I remember when I was recruiting at Sanofi, and I actually just sent out the job description through my personal networks. And so one of the women who emerged is a woman who went to MIT undergrad, Hopkins Med School, Hopkins School of Public Health, and Wharton for her MBA, and had 25 years of industry experience. And so I was a little concerned though, because she's African American, and we were going to be like the two African Americans, and I didn't want to be seen as the one who only hires African Americans. And so I went to the woman executive who I reported to, and I was like, so, we're going to have an issue. You're going to probably get some pushback. And then she said, yeah, but I hired this guy. He only hired white males, and nobody like bats an eye at that. And I said, yeah, but that's not a luxury that I have. And then she said, well, is she qualified? So she's frankly overqualified. She could be my boss, much less me being her boss. And then she said, so the question is not why did you hire her, but the question is why we haven't before she came on board. And so and again, when we were at Quorum, we were building up that organization. We had an HR consultant who came in and she said, this is the most diverse organization I've ever seen. Like, what did you do? And so I turned to my gay Mexican chief of staff and we were like, I don't know. I'm like, we just hire the best. But because I was in a position of leadership, assumptions were never stated. They might have been thought, but they were not stated, as well as they could be challenged. And so there was one woman, Black woman, African actually, who her boss said, well, she doesn't really like to write. And I said, wait a minute, but she was an English major in an undergrad, and then she was just at the Brookings Institute where she did a number of first authored articles. And so what is it exactly that makes you say she doesn't like to write? And so had I not been in the room, who knows, what assumptions would have been made about her. So I think that, there's a lot of discussions now, particularly in terms of racism, on structural racism and institutional racism. But I think the same thing goes, in terms of the challenges that we experience as women, that we are well prepared. We're in fact over prepared, and yet still have to prove ourselves in so many different ways. And even with my pedigree, when I think back, there was only once in my career where I felt like I didn't have to prove myself, where instead I felt like I was assumed to be competent and had to prove that I was incompetent, as compared to most of the times we come in feeling like we have to prove ourselves, or you have to earn that promotion, or if you earn that next job. No, and that's not how the guys are. The guys, like, I've seen so many incompetent guys who just kind of fake it till they make it. And then, sometimes they make it, sometimes they don't. And when they don't make it, they're like, oh, well, let's give them like a nice bonus to get out of here because he has like 3 kids. I'm like, well, I have 3 kids, and if you guys fired me, there's no way in hell you would, pay me for the privilege to leave your organization. So, so I think we need to start to question some of the assumptions that are made. And yes, we show up and we're prepared. And so we know that from the perspective of graduating from college, that now actually there's affirmative action towards men because women are showing up much better prepared than men are. And if they were to just be accepted into colleges based only on their academic capabilities, that the colleges would be lopsided in terms of the number of women that are there. The group who has the highest rate of getting college degrees in the United States is Black women. Black women are the most educated demographic group in the US. And, we're never satisfied with just getting our undergrad degrees. We got to go and get the master's and then 2 masters and a PhD, et cetera, because this is what our mothers told us that we had to do. Everyone's told you have to be twice as good to be considered half as good. And yet it is not about being prepared. It is not about, we're not ready. It is about the institutions are not ready for us.
Yeah, it's interesting because all the conversation around like lean in, you got to lean in, you got to do all of this, and it's focusing on the wrong thing, right? You've got to change the whole structure and context around which we're trying to excel as women. You also have the benefit of having really sat in so many different types of organizations, been in academia, you've been in a large corporation, you've been on a government with the Affordable Care Act. You've worn so many different hats, which is really enriches, I think, your perspective because you have. And one of the conversations you were having is about looking at women looking at their careers, and we also have life events, not solely attributable to women, but having children or elder care, caring for parents or what have you. And we were talking about kind of how you kind of have to think about how you manage through those events, but look holistically at your career path. And I didn't know if you wanted to talk a little bit about that, given the variety of generations on this call. I think it would be very relevant for many of us. Probably not me at this point, but
well, I remember when I was a fellow, we used to be sitting there doing our work, and I would turn to one of my colleagues and I was like, you know what, when we're on our deathbeds, we're never going to say, I wish I had written one more paper. And I was like, let's go home, right? We have these kids, and it feels like, when you have these kids, my 2 oldest were 15 months apart. And so it killed me to have those kids back to back. And I was just so tired all the time. And it feels like it's just forever, but it actually is incredibly fleeting. As I said, we just dropped our youngest off at college, and I'm like, what, huh? How did that happen? But it does happen. And the reality is when it comes to that quote unquote balance, it drives me crazy because I'm like, women are not having these babies alone. Like there's somebody else who's there, who's involved, and no one is asking what is the role that your partner plays. What I will say is that of the senior executives who are women, many of them had stay-at-home husbands, many of them. And so I tell my daughters, I'm like, you need to marry well. And that doesn't mean marrying rich. That means marrying someone who has your back and is definitely working with you as a team to really hold it down. And so like you heard me say that we hopped around, we went to Paris, to Washington, to New York. So I wasn't doing that by myself. I had a husband who was willing and able to make those kind of moves to come with me. And the women that I've seen who really progress, sometimes it's, the move is for his sake, sometimes it's for her sake, but it really has to be a partnership. There was also a period in my life when I was a single parent. And so I was very deliberate, first of all, in making sure that I had all the help around me that I could get and that I could afford. But then also learning how to say no.
Alexa, stop.
No. So learning how to say no to a lot of different things so that I could be there and be available for my kids. And I had a mentor once who said, listen, there's no such thing as having it all. And she said, as a physician, she says, sometimes I'm a great physician, and then the pendulum swings back, and then sometimes I'm a great mother, but I can never be both at the same time. And so you just have to kind of learn how to compartmentalize. And I remember when I was faculty at Harvard, and my kids were really young at that point, and I was just like, I'm sitting in faculty meetings thinking about Halloween costumes, and I'm at home thinking about a presentation that I have to do to submit for this scientific meeting. And I'm just like, so scattered. And so their recommendation was actually to learn about meditation and to learn about being in that space so that your mind is not scattered, but that when you're in that space, you're giving it your 100% attention. And then you learn different tools to be able to park the ideas and park the things that you have to deal with where you need to. So obviously, if I'm sitting in a faculty meeting, there's nothing I can do about that Halloween costume. But what I can do is I used to call myself at home and leave a voicemail message and say, don't forget to look up Halloween costumes and order them online, so that when I come home, that I make up my list of stuff that I need to do at home. And similarly, when I was at home thinking about, the deadline for such and such is coming up, I would leave a voicemail message for myself at the office so that the idea would come up, I could drop it at a place where then I could actually do something about it, and then get back to being in the moment. But I don't think there's such a thing as having it all. I think there is a pendulum.
Yeah, it's so true. And I do the same thing because I'm a visual person. If I don't write it down, it'll go. So I send myself emails, I put it on my calendar. I definitely have to do that. One point, and then I want folks, obviously, please, after this next question, want folks to jump in with any questions they would like to ask Anne. One of the things in our conversation that I thought was so important to hear, and wish I had heard it earlier when I was younger, is you say, you look at women's professional trajectory and really you peak at about 55 or so. And so you have to be, your frame of reference and your timeline and how you plan for that needs to be geared differently. And I was wondering if you would share that. I just thought it was fascinating and important.
Yeah, I mean, when I was younger, like we're always kind of on the lookout for racism and sexism and things like that, but I never considered ageism, right? And part of that is because I was young. But also there is an intersection of race and gender and age that makes, I think, particularly Black women, women of color, very vulnerable. And so there's something that happened. So, I mean, you've heard my pedigree. So my friends are not slouches, right? But then all of a sudden we hit 50 and this one was getting laid off, that one was getting laid off. I had friends who had tenure and they were like being removed from tenure held faculty positions. And I was like, what the hell is going on? And I remember when I finished my fellowship, my chairman said to me, he's like, okay, so what job do you want? What is it that we can do? I was like, well, I want to do teaching and research and work in the community. And, I just was all over the map. And so what he said is, listen, you have a 30-year career, do all of those things, but do them one at a time, which was, a really good piece of advice. The only thing that I think he was wrong is he should have told me that I had a 20-year career, because I have not seen any women over the age of 50 go higher than where they are at that age of 50. In addition, I was shocked, as I said, at the number of women who ended up getting laid off or pushed out or whatever. And I think part of it is this convergence of when you start to hit your 50s is when you really should be making like the big bucks in terms of being like a senior executive. And I think there's a disconnect between paying women, particularly women of color, those kind of dollars and what they envision. So when you think about like, some senior whatever, you don't think of someone who looks like me. Right? You think of like some old white guy. And so so many of my friends started to get laid off, and what they ended up having to do in order to stay in the workforce was to get another type of job where they had to take a salary cut. And so like, not everybody wants to be an entrepreneur. Not everybody wants to go and travel around the world. But I think in our heads, a lot of us think, okay, I'm going to work really hard for 30 years. And then when I hit a certain age, then I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. That time may come sooner than you think. And so if it is about investing money so that you can retire early, if it is about starting a business, if it is about even having kids or buying that second house or learning another language, whatever it is, that's the kind of thing that's in the back of your head, you're saying, I'm going to do one day, recognize that one day may come sooner than you anticipate and do not put it off. The other thing is, and I've said this to so many people, do not love a job more than it loves you. And we've seen this so much in COVID, where as soon as like stuff got sketchy, everyone got fired. Or whenever there's kind of an issue or an economic downturn, people get fired. And so like you go to work, again, people are professional, right? We're used to being like the A student sitting up in front of the class, answering all the questions, getting your assignments in on time. It doesn't work like that in the workforce. It is not a meritocracy. And so you can go to work, do the right thing and not advance. No one's going to like recognize you for your work. You have to really be, I want to say self-promotional, although that has negative connotations, but I really think it does not. Or let's say self-preservation in terms of like, preserve your career. But then also you have to recognize that no one is beholden to you. And when you get 50 in particular, if there's a bump in the road, you will be the first one to go, and you need to be prepared for that. And I saw that back in the 2008 economic downturn, where many of us were working in philanthropy, and like Ford Foundation, Robert Wood Johnson, they laid off 30% of their workforce and they went for the older workers first. So it doesn't matter if you're in government, it doesn't matter if you're in nonprofit, it doesn't matter if you're in for-profit. The older you get, the more expensive you are and the more expendable you are. Because there are younger people who will do the same job and then be willing to be paid less for it. So I think we have to be more self-preserving, willing to take whatever chances we want to take and make whatever moves we want to make. And think about if you had to retire, say at 50 rather than 60, what does that mean?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I have a couple more questions at a minimum, but can folks raise their hand if they would like to ask Anne a question? I want to make sure we have time for that. So raise your hand either visually or use your little hand icon down here, and I'm happy to field questions. And while we're waiting to see if I get any raised hands, can we, and I do want to make a particular observation or comment about your comment about meditation and mindfulness, and that I highly recommend, because I think all of us, we've got so many different balls up in the air, and I find myself doing the same thing, particularly in this remote environment, right, where you're not physically in a room with somebody. And I find myself very, very frequently during any day saying to myself, no, you focus here on what's on, because otherwise your mind is, well, I've got to do this and I've got to do that and I've got all these other challenges. So I think that's a great thing.
The other thing, there's two other things, is be comfortable with saying no. And don't say no because I have to do, but nope, no. Sorry, can't do that. Sorry, nope, can't do that. I'm not available and I'm not going to be available. That's one thing. The other thing, and I used to say this to my team, is that there are things that are valuable. So we should value our time. We should value our intellectual property. We should value the people on our teams. We should value, we always value our money. And so what I say though is that if someone came along and said, and this is in a professional environment, if someone came along and said, well, you know what, I want you to give me like 20% of your budget, we would say, no, what the hell are you talking about? But at the same time, they want to come and like have 20% of your time, or like have your ideas, or have people on your team or whatever. So you have to recognize that, it's called human resource, it's called financial resource, it's called intellectual resource, and that we need to protect them all as violently as we say, protect our family, protect our friends, protect our social networks, and protect our money. And so think about like your time as your money, and all of a sudden you will find that you are not letting people waste your time, because you wouldn't let them waste your money.
Absolutely. We've talked a bit about, and I think any organization, including ours, talking about the role, importance, relevance of mentoring and mentorship. What has your experience been or perspective in terms of mentorship versus sponsorship, and kind of how we can reach across, down and up to raise this all up
Yeah. So as I mentioned, I'm raising money now, and they say that, if you go and ask someone for advice, you get money, and if you go and ask for money, you get advice. And so what I find though is that people always want to give advice. It's basically a statement to them that you value their opinion. And so, I mean, whether they're the CEO or the CFO or like Joe Okey Doke down the hall, people are always willing to give advice. And so I think it is always wise to be able to tap into people around you. I've had people come to me and say, would you be a mentor? And I don't really know what that means. I always say yes to any phone call that comes in or people want to have a meeting. But there's not everyone understands my whole experience. And so for example, one of my early mentors is one of my best mentors, and I tapped into for 20 years in my career, is a white Jewish woman. Well, I'm not a white Jewish woman, but she had so much knowledge and wisdom to give to me that I definitely valued her opinion. And so you never know where like the next tip is going to come from. And whether it's gender or age or race or whatever, what you want to do is just to be open in your thinking, and then just ask anyone for advice. So as I mentioned, I'm now 60, and it's funny. So sometimes I'm dealing with people because I'm in this beauty space, and they're trying to like help me with Instagram. And I was like, oh my God, they think that I'm old and they think that I don't know how to use Instagram. I'm like, so then I get a little, okay, but let me show you something, right? But the fact is that, what they're trying to do is help me. And to be honest, I know Instagram because I sat down with my teenager. I was like, okay, what's up? Tell me what's going on. And like, how do I do this? So, whatever it is, whatever you have to learn, there's wisdom that's all around you. Now, sponsorship is a whole nother story. And I think that's actually a little bit more difficult because I think it really does require a personal connection that usually falls along racial and gender lines. So it is very, very challenging. But kind of being front and center in someone's thinking and tapping into them, I think most people are genuinely giving in their spirits and would be more than happy to provide advice. And so it never hurts to ask.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the sponsorship piece it is very thorny because in any organization, like who's going to be your sponsor, meaning use their political capital in the organization in your favor, right, in support of you. And I think that's very hard. And it's hard to develop organically, but even more difficult to impose it on a relationship, right? I mean, how do you, I think that's been a challenge. We have also now, we're in the beginning stages of rolling out an allyship program to try to start to build more of that, those connections, more awareness among the majority, white men, in terms of being allies, mentor sponsors to the diverse attorneys and others in the firm.
So I will share one tip that the CEO of Aetna gave me, and he said that in his career, he has always tried to have lunch with one new person every single week. And he said, you never know where that's going to take you, what relationship, and it's not even an agenda around it, but it's just, let me sit down and chat with you and get to know you a little bit better. And he says that there have been benefits to that are just, that he could never anticipate. I personally am an extroverted person. And so I don't mind going into a room and meeting people, while like an introvert, my husband's a profound introvert. To him, that's like hell on wheels is to ask him to do that. But for me, sitting at a bus stop, I'll sit and have a conversation with person sitting at the bus stop. And so I've never been the kind of person who wants to network because it sounds so, to me, it sounds fake and that there's an intention behind it. I genuinely enjoy meeting people and enjoy talking to them. And so that has taken me in places and spaces that I never expected.
Yeah, I agree. And the networking, it sounds so transactional versus, building relationships. So are there questions from others in the group session here for Anne? We always leave 5 minutes at the end for Meg to share her perspective. I guess I will take a little bit of Meg's thunder here and just say, if you were to, one thing we always like to do at Quorum, right, is to be action oriented. And so you've given us so much to think about in our own careers and lives, but kind of collectively as an organization, what are some of the things that you would recommend an organization like Quorum that helps to lift up and support executive women can do together to move the ball?
Well, we were just talking about that networking that can happen. And I know it's very hard now because we're in COVID times, and the before times it was a lot easier. But I think those kind of networks really are very, very useful. We have, actually, there's an organization called the ELC, the Executive Leadership Council, which is made up of African-American executives that are like you have to be N-1 or 2 from the CEO in order to join. And so we have like an annual meeting, we have meetings for the women, we have meetings for junior executives. And then one of the principles is that if anybody ever calls you from an ELC, who's an ELC member, you have to respond to that call. And so there have been times when I've been looking at jobs or even board positions, and I could call an ELC member and know that they would respond. And so I think that kind of network is very helpful. I will say there's other women organizations that I'm part of, and one of them, it drives me crazy because people say, hey, I got this promotion, I got this, and everybody's like, yay. And I'm like, it's okay, listen, we're not cheerleaders here. Like, let's kind of like network with each other. And these are like powerful women, and I don't need any more friends. I don't need any more cheerleaders. I need like a hookup. And so that's what I would challenge you to think about, is that if this is an organization of women who can really provide that hookup, to really start providing that hookup. I mean, and you hear about like these fraternities and these secret societies that men have where if you just call and you say, hey, I'm a member of blah, blah, Sigma Chi, whatever, people will pick up the phone and support one another just because they're part of that. So I think that what I find with women's organizations is I want to see us playing more like the boys do, and really leveraging the power that we have, the capabilities that we have, the networks that we have, and to stop being cheerleaders. I'm done with it.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. Okay, Meg, I hope I didn't step too much on you.
You didn't. And thank you. I so appreciate that last comment because I feel like one of the great things about women's organizations is the notion of support, and we all do need support. There's no question about it. But you're right. In order to get change to happen or things to move, or we actually need more than that. We actually need more action than that. So that's kind of amazing. And Tara, thank you so much for moderating the session, because Anne delivered so many pearls of wisdom throughout this thing. My list is so long. I usually like to repeat the ones that I love the most, but I have 12, so that's a really long list. But I will actually share it maybe with Diane, and we'll put it in a follow-up note, the ones I like the best. But there were a couple things that stood out for me that I just thought I would mention, and I want to thank you, Anne, for sharing them with us. I really loved the notion of paying attention to communities around us, whether it's the men. You talked about Jewish community and how they operate, how they're doing things that help them achieve more or find better footing or better positioning. There hasn't been enough coalescing around with women, and there's something really great about finding those examples and thinking about them. So I loved that part of your story. I also was fascinated, about your vision around the fact that institutions aren't ready for the talent that they have, actually. And it's almost always the women and people of color, and particularly women of color. So there you go. So that's just incredible to me. And it's something I think we really have to think about, because that's going to require serious change, or we're going to have to do what you're doing, Anne, which is create a different environment, full stop, and that not everybody's up to that challenge. I'm so excited that you're taking that on. can't wait to see where Absolute Joy goes.
But people can take on leadership. Yeah, but they can also take on leadership within their organizations.
They can. You're absolutely right.
And I think that that plays a role.
I loved the notion of do not love a job more than it loves you, because women are so loyal and fabulous and such hardworking, so intentional with everything we do. And it does not always give back, often does not give back. So that was such a great comment. So I loved that. I love the notion of valuing your gifts and protecting them. You talked about this notion of, make sure you believe and understand your own value and that people aren't stealing that from you. So that was just fantastic. Thank you for that. So I could go on and on. As you can see, I really wrote a list, just so you know, I really wrote a list. I have 12. And I wanted to thank you so much for being willing to take time out of your very busy schedule to be with us and share your insights. It's so valuable to this community, and we really appreciate it. As Tara talked about, we try to spend time thinking about at the end of every time we get a chance to get together. And of course, right now it's all virtual. Unfortunately, we miss being together physically, as you would imagine, and with each other. But we talk a lot about action. And as Tara mentioned, and I just wondered, you left us with this notion is, I need a hookup. I just wonder if our action this time around isn't around what can we do for someone else, and be very intentional about that over the next 2 weeks. What have you done for somebody else that's going to make a difference to them? Because we all have so many great connections. We have so many such great experience to share with each other. I think that we could take that on as one of our big actions. Is everybody up for that?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I wanted to just mention to everybody all the great stuff coming up, because we've got amazing content happening at Quorum in the weeks ahead. Diane, always sends around information about what's happening, but I wanted to remind all of you that we have a cohort meeting coming up, so members can get together, and it's a really great moment of sharing. It's like the best 45 minutes for me that I get, where people really talk about what they've been focused on, what they're doing. You get to know each other a little bit better, and that's virtual. It's well worth your time and energy. So the next one coming up is on October 21st. Then we have Rita Mcgrath, who I don't know if coming to speak with us, and she is a professor at Columbia in their business school, but it was also written several books and is out consulting to some of the big Fortune 500. And a lot of what she focuses on is how do you pay attention to what's coming in the marketplace, and sort of thinking about strategic inflection points. So that's going to be it's something she's just written a lot about in her recent book. She's a terrific speaker. I've had the opportunity to see her many times. I think you'd really enjoy her. So that's coming up on October 27th. And then when we have a book club, and for those that participated in the last book, I absolutely loved our book club session, I have to tell you. So it's a not to miss, and that's on November 3rd, and Deborah DeSantis and Lynn Murphy Rivera are going to lead that conversation. So that's what we have coming up. So, and if we were there in person, we'd all give you this enormous applause and thank you for being so gracious with your time and sharing so many amazing insights. Your journey is incredible, very inspiring. We wish you so much good fortune with this new project that you're on, this new venture that you're undertaking. I'm sure it's going to be a huge success. We look forward to following that. And if there's anything any of us could do, please reach out. We would love to give back. So
here's my ask: follow me on social, comment. No,
all those thumbs up.
Yeah, that works. I love it. I love it.
It actually, there's a whole algorithm that's working in the background, and it really does make a difference. So there's a lot of ways to support a business without just even purchasing.
But,
helping,
that's amazing.
Helping it to work, that algorithm makes a difference.
Well, there you go. I love it. That gives us a second action item. How about that?
There you
Awesome.
go.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Tara.
Thank you.
Again, thank you so much for moderating
pleasure.
this wonderful session. And thanks so much for your time. It's so great to see all of you. I look forward to seeing you again soon. And